So before we wrap up this section of the course and move on to looking at our web frameworks, let's revisit our command line blogging system that we created a few lessons ago and update it with some of the things that we've learned in the past few lessons. So I've just initialized a new project and I've installed 3 dependencies: Chalk, which is for stylizing our output on the command line; Inquirer, which will enable us to take data from the command line in an easier manner; and also SQLite, which will enable us to save our blog posts into an actual database. And I'm going to create some scripts that can be run with the npm run command. So I've created add, which will be for adding new posts to the database, view, which will be for listing all of the posts in the database, and also a final command which is setup, which will actually create the database itself. And each one of those commands will actually just run a separate JavaScript file. And I'm also going to create a config file, which will basically be a module that exports some information about the database that we'll use. And this literally will just consist of a name for the database file and also the table that will contain all of our blog posts. So let's start off by creating the setup file, which will have the job of creating the database. So the first thing I'm going to do is require the config module that we just created, Chalk, and also SQLite. The next thing I'll do is create a connection to the database using a function available on the SQLite module that we've just imported. And you can see already how setting the database details in the config file has already proved useful because I haven't had to hard code it into this file. The next thing we'll do when the setup program gets executed is actually just run a simple SQL statement to create the database table. So the SQL statement that's constructed basically is going to create a table that has some fields in it, such as the title, the date, the author, and the post text. And then we run that statement on the SQLite database, and we get an error first callback, and if there is an error, we're going to display a message. If not, we'll display a message saying that everything went okay. And at that point, we know the table is created, ready to accept posts. So let's actually test that out now by running it from the command line. And that looks like it went okay, and you can see in our file explorer on the left hand side that we've got a new file called blogdb.db, which should actually contain that new table. So the benefit of creating a setup program like this is that if anyone else wanted to install this package locally, they could grab hold of the entire project and run this setup program to get a copy of the database of themselves. The next thing we'll do is create the add post functionality. So to start off, I've just imported all of the modules that we're going to need to add a post to the database, and also set up a connection to the database and stored it in a variable called db. So in the previous incarnation of our command line blog system, we accepted the title and author of the post via command line arguments, but this time we're actually going to accept all of the data for the post using the Inquirer package, which basically prompts you on the command line to enter data line by line. So the way it works is we pass an array of objects into the prompt function of Inquirer, and we specify a variable name that the data will be stored into, and also a message to display on the command line. And you can see for the date option I've actually supplied a default value as well, defaulting to the current timestamp. So once the user has provided answers to all those questions, we can access the responses with inside a then function. And I'll destructure the answers object into the respective variable names, so I'll have title, author, date, and post extracted into their own variables, and then we'll pass this to the database as an SQL statement, and then we'll pass this as an SQL statement into the database. And we've had to wrap all of the strings in quotes inside of our template literal, so it's a little bit messy, and there are much better ways of doing this, but it'll be okay for the example that we're doing here. And once we've run that statement against the database, we'll just log a message out to the user to let them know it's completed and then close the connection to the database. So if we open up the terminal and give that a whirl and see what it looks like. Oh, whoops, so that's given us an error, and I called the script add, not add post, so let's try that again. So you can see Inquirer just asks us on the command line to actually fill in all of the details for the blog post. So that should have added all of those details into the database as a blog post. Of course, we need to finish off our project by completing the view post functionality so that we can actually retrieve the posts from the database. So again, I've just set up our imports, and again, it's been useful to just get the data from the config module without having to remember the database name explicitly. So in this view post program, we'll just actually run a select statement against the database to get all of the blog posts from our table. So once we've constructed our select statement, we pass that to the database connection using the each function, which will basically return a list of rows that match the select query and call the function once for each row that's returned. And I've not done anything fancy with the actual output, but you can see the title, date, author and post details, so you could make up your own formatting, or however you wanted to present that, to make it look a bit more interesting. But let's try it out and see if we can actually access the blog post that we just created. And as you can see, the blog post that we just created a second ago has just been printed back out to the console by running the view posts program. So that completes our new command line blogging system. Obviously, there's other things that you can do with it. You can format the output in any way that you like, or as we did in a previous lesson, you could then send this to a web server so that it could be viewable within a web browser. But we've seen how to create setup scripts and use the data that's supplied to us in our own modules that we've created, and we've also learned about a few new npm packages that we can use to make more interesting and complex projects.